This is great. People are joining us from all over the country.
Great.
All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome everybody to the 4th Heschel King Forum. We are pleased that you are joining us. We're going to start with a welcoming prayer from Rabbi Neil Comas-Daniels.
Good evening, everyone. We gather together within the oneness of all being, across time and space, to speak of justice and righteousness, and perhaps most importantly, responsibility. May we be worthy of our task. May our speakers use all their scholarship, experience, and oratory skill to persuade us to be like Drs. King and Heschel, that we might pray with our legs. May we be inspired to address wounds festering now and for decades before deep within American society's flesh. May our empathy rise so that we feel and understand one another's pain. May respect bubble to the surface of our skin, that we might see the flame at the core of the universe within the eyes of everyone. As Heschel did, may we recognize that to be just is not a virtue deserving honor and rewards, that in doing righteousness one confers a favor on society. No one expects to receive a reward for the habit of breathing, he said. Justice is just as much a necessity as breathing is a constant occupation. When speaking of the prophetic soul, which Heschel said should affect and infect all of us, he said, God's concern for justice grows out of God's compassion for women and men. The prophets do not speak of a divine relationship to an absolute principle or idea called justice, he said. They are so intoxicated with the awareness of God's relationship to all humanity. May Dr. Heschel's powerful, masterfully crafted words serve as our guide this evening. When Cain murdered his brother Abel, the words denouncing his crime did not proclaim, "You have broken the law." Instead, we read, "And the Lord said, 'What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground.'" Heschel proclaimed, "An act of injustice is condemned not because the law is broken, but because a person has been hurt." Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Comas-Daniels, for opening this evening with an inspiring prayer. And thanks to our co-sponsors, who will be listed on the screen. Thank you to Arnetta Mack, our graphics designer, and Chris Tucker, who provided technical support. Our committee members, Karen Helfman, Steve Rohde, Rabbi Neil Comas-Daniels, Pastors William Smart and Margaret McCauley, Jennifer Levin, and Gregory Gorman, helped to make this event possible. We wanted to learn more about reparations and restorative justice, what it means, what it can do, and how it might work. This program is a project of the Black Jewish Justice Alliance, which is a creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Southern California and Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. We are a group of Blacks and Jews who are dedicated to improving interracial and ethnic relations among our fellow women and men, to further civil rights and criminal and restorative justice. We seek to rebuild the historic partnership between African Americans and Jews as exemplified by the relationship between Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King. Some of the issues which concern us are white supremacy, that is combating racism and anti-Semitism, ending gun violence, checking law enforcement and over-policing of communities, and ending the mass jailing of people of color. Pastor Smart is now going to welcome with some of the words of Martin Luther King. Pastor?
Greetings, my sisters and brothers and welcome to tonight's outstanding program. It is a program that we're having as we're celebrating the week of sacrifice, the week that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, but we like to say, and we believe it was a sacrifice, because he knew exactly what he was up against and what he was doing on behalf of people. You know, one of the important things that he believed in was the beloved community, a community that was going to be devoid of poverty, of capitalism, and of racism. Today, more than ever before, we find ourselves right back where he started from. I read an article just last week in Time magazine that talked about his issues around voting rights are still facing us today. It is as if he never died and he never fought. The very issues he fought for are real today, some 53 years later. So we assemble ourselves here tonight. We're assembled together to talk about reparations. The words of Dr. King would say that until one of us is set free, all of us will remain in bondage. We must work together as people, human beings, religious people, people who believe in the human spirit of each other, and say that we are going to rise above and do more to transform America into that beloved community. So welcome tonight. And thank you so much, Patsy, for pulling it together, and all the other participants in this program. God bless you. It's my pleasure now to introduce.
Not yet.
Okay.
Today's program is in two parts, and the first part is the historical background to reparations. Our speaker is Professor David Myers. Dr. Myers holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at the UCLA History Department, and he is also the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He is the author or editor of 15 books, most recently with his wife, Nomi Stolzenberg, on the Satmar Hasidic community in New York. He is also the president of the New Israel Fund, an organization whose objective is to support social justice and equality for all citizens of Israel. David has been a champion of progressive causes for as long as I have known him, which is several decades. David?
Thank you so much, Patsy. It's really a delight and pleasure to be here with you, especially to be part of the Black Jewish Justice Alliance and this fourth Heschel King Forum. The Black Jewish Alliance has been an extraordinarily formative part of my own being and upbringing. I'm going to now share a PowerPoint so we can make our way through some of the history of reparations, and try to make this. Well, I'll just, until I can do otherwise, I'll proceed this way. I can make a slideshow. Okay. All right. So I'm delighted to see that the Black Jewish Alliance has assumed a new forum in our own day in the state of Georgia, of all places, as we see on the right, in the new duly elected senators, one a Jew and another a Black man, Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff. Georgia and the senatorial race remind us of how important the struggle is over the franchise. It is about the vote, and it has been since Reconstruction, if not before then, in 1865, when Black men were first briefly accorded the right to vote freely. We are reminded of the persistence of restrictions placed on Black women and men voting by the recent law limiting voter access in Georgia, signed on the right by Governor Brian Kemp. This obviously is an extremely important area of continued activity by Blacks and Jews, and of central importance, I think, to the Black Jewish Alliance. But our task today is to talk about another important front in the struggle for justice, reparations. And let's begin with a little etymological discussion. The word reparations, the English word reparations, comes from repair, from the Latin reparare, which means to mend, to put back together, to a pristine state, as in making someone or something whole. Some of you may be familiar with the Mishnaic or rabbinic term, tikkun olam, which is really a more sweeping form of repair, kind of collective repair. It means repair of the world. But the Bible earlier, before the rabbinic period, focuses on repair in the individual sense when it speaks of the manumission of slaves, and states in the book of Deuteronomy that the slave owner should not let the slave, the freed slave, go away empty. Thou shalt furnish him or her liberally out of thy flock. And so this, here we see a very early version of the impulse to mend or to make one whole through the act of monetary compensation, material compensation. Now, there is a great question that attends what we've just discussed, and I think what will be discussed in the panel, and that is really the question of whether reparations bring justice. I think there are three principles that I'd like to bear in mind in kind of thinking through that question with you. First, as long as there is injustice, there will be a demand for repair or remedy to it. Second, the demand will almost always come from the aggrieved or injured party. And third, and most significantly, the outcome will almost always be imperfect, an imperfect rendering of justice. And I was reminded of this when I read a few days ago in the New York Times, a story on Holocaust survivors receiving vaccinations. And it quoted a 96-year-old survivor by the name of Ava Rose, who really crystallized the imperfect nature of reparations when she said that Germany pays for some things, but they could never pay for what I lost. And what she lost was 30 members of her family. And yet, the appeal to reparation has been consistent and persistent, especially over the last 3 centuries or so, from the 18th century. Historian Ana Lucia Araujo has written an important account of the efforts of former slaves across the Americas and in Europe to demand compensation for their suffering. The first efforts extend back to the late 18th century. And in fact, in the late 18th century, we have a very interesting case in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where in 1783, Belinda Royal Sutton, a Ghanaian-born slave, who was freed, petitioned the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for a pension owing to her former enslavement. And in that year, in 1783, she was indeed awarded a pension of some £15 to be paid from the estate of her former slave owner, Isaac Royal. So we see this early example that is oft quoted in the history of reparations in the United States. Perhaps a more well-known example, which is a form of reparations proposed, albeit not in monetary form, came after the Emancipation Proclamation, a few weeks after, when General William Tecumseh Sherman issued a special order granting 40 acres of land to freed slaves. Not yet a mule, that came later, but 40 acres of land in January 1865. And within 6 months, 40,000 freed people had settled on more than 400,000 acres of this land that came as a form of reparation. It was a short-lived attempt because Abraham Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, reversed Sherman's decree shortly after taking over. And so we see that reparations from the late 18th century in the United States, certainly in the wake of the Civil War, proceeded very much in fits and starts. However, a more successful deployment of the model of reparations, and one which ties together, again, the fates of Blacks and Jews in the quest for justice and liberation, came about 80 years later or so, in the wake of the greatest instance of state-sponsored murder ever undertaken to that point, which in fact necessitated the creation of a new term, genocide, which emerged in the midst of what we now commonly refer to as the Holocaust. The criminals who perpetrated the Holocaust, who sent people to places like the place on the left, Auschwitz-Birkenau, with its infamous sign, "Work makes free," the criminals who were responsible for setting up death camps and for the murders of tens of millions of people, including 6 million Jews, were called to justice at the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946. Subsequently, the successor state to Nazi Germany, West Germany, undertook to provide reparations to Jewish victims in several ways. One was by reaching an agreement with the government of the newly created state of Israel to provide reparations to the state as home to a large number of Jews. And in the middle, you see a picture of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer signing the agreement that would provide reparations to the state of Israel. It's very interesting to note and relevant to our conversation about reparations as a form of imperfect justice that Israel's leading opposition politician at that time, the person depicted at the right, Menachem Begin, then leader of the Herut party, later prime minister, led a very vigorous protest against the acceptance of reparations from West Germany. And you can see on this banner below him some of the rationale for his refusal to accept reparations. It says, our honor will not be sold for money, or we will obliterate the indignity of the acceptance of reparations. And in fact, Begin would go on after this speech to lead a demonstration that breached the walls of the Israeli Knesset. So outraged was he by this decision. In the same year, 1952, a new body was established called the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, known as the Claims Conference, that was set up to provide material compensation for damage to Jews during the Holocaust. So this, I would suggest to you, this conjuncture of events taking place in 1952 set up perhaps the most robust mechanism of reparations that we have seen in the modern age. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Congress established in 1946, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, an Indian Claims Commission to address disputes over land between the federal government and Native American tribes. And the government felt compelled to do so because of the participation of so many Native Americans as soldiers in the Second World War. Here, the Claims Commission, you can see below a group of Native American leaders meeting with Harry Truman, focused their attention on restitution of land, the return of land that they believe had been stolen from them. And that indeed has been a focus of Native American quests for justice. I think in particular of Native American scholar Daniel Wildcat, who in a 2014 essay in the Washington Post made clear that Native Americans, at least as he understood it, did not want reparations, did not want monetary compensation. Rather, they wanted their land back. So the Indian Claims Commission did not bring about a full act of reparation. It continued to adjudicate claims over land until the early 1970s. Its focus, as we've noticed, was not monetary compensation, unlike the case of Japanese Americans, who, as we recall, were incarcerated as suspected enemies in concentration camps in this country, beginning in 1942, a move that was upheld by the United States Supreme Court in its infamous Korematsu decision. For some 40 years, this act of injustice went unrecognized and unrepaired until 1988, when Congress passed and then President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act that included an apology on behalf of the United States to those incarcerated, and an award of $20,000 to each of the survivors of the camps. Minimal as that may have been, this may be the most robust form of reparation ever provided by the United States government. Shortly after this act, 1988, Congressman John Conyers in 1989 began to sponsor on an annual basis H.R. 40, a call for Congress to create a commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. The focus of his efforts and those who supported it was on slavery and its victims, but not exclusively so. The language of the proposal also calls attention to the de jure and de facto discrimination against freed slaves and their descendants from the end of the Civil War to the present. Through this attempted congressional act, which Congressman Conyers introduced every year until his death, and which has been introduced ever since, the idea of setting up a mechanism to study seriously reparations has become mainstream. For example, in the 2020 election, 17 Democratic candidates supported the gist of H.R. 40. Only one, Steve Bullock, opposed it. And here I think we have to note the important role played by author and thinker Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a celebrated article, a widely read article in 2014 called The Case for Reparations. It generated a great deal of attention and conversation and gave new credibility and legitimacy to reparations as a necessary tool of restorative justice. I should also note that the idea has gained traction in the international community after 20 years of debate and reflection by a number of international legal scholars and the United Nations Human Rights Commission. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in 2005, Resolution 6147, that accepted the principle of reparations as a tool of justice in the international legal arena. Meanwhile, back in the United States, as we know, just very recently, the city of Evanston, Illinois, took very concrete action when it decided to set up a kind of reparations mechanism that would provide $25,000 for home purchase or repair to African-American residents of the city in recognition of discriminatory housing practices that have lasted for decades, including and especially redlining. The debate over the wisdom and ultimate underlying justice of reparations continues, and indeed in animated form. I'd call your attention to the very important work of the scholars William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, who make a very strong case for reparations in their recent book, From Here to Equality. But it's also important to note that there has been resistance akin to that of the Holocaust survivor that I mentioned, Ava Rose. For example, the Black author and intellectual Jesse McCarthy poses the question in his collection of essays entitled "Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul?" He asks, what can reparations mean when the damage cannot be accounted for in the only system of accounting that a society recognizes? So what this very brief survey, I think, demonstrates is that there have been powerful arguments to be had on both sides. At best, reparations are a form of imperfect justice, but when accompanied by recognition of the crime committed and acknowledgement of responsibility, they can play a role symbolically and materially in fulfilling the task implied in the very term itself, which is mending or putting back together. So I thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and I will now stop sharing and hand things back to Patsy.
Well, David, a couple of questions have come up if you have a moment to. Anne asks, why have African Americans not been successful in garnering even an apology for slavery in comparison to the other groups you mentioned, such as Japanese Americans and Native Americans?
Well, I suspect that will be part of the discussion on the panel, but a very simple answer to Anne's excellent question is certainly with respect to the one case that we have that has introduced the reparations model, which is the Japanese American case, the scale of the crime committed against African Americans, beginning with slavery and extending through to various forms of state-sponsored discrimination and bias. The scale of it is such as to be almost impossible for those in power to grasp the actual costs, as distinct from the delimited nature of the Japanese American case. 3 years, I don't for a second mean to minimize the deep scars, the psychic wounds of being incarcerated and cast as enemy aliens, almost as citizens, but it was confined to a 3-year period. Where does one begin to calculate the possible cost? So I think both the size of the cost and the size and scale of the actual injustice seem, in some sense, too large to confront. And I think that's been a major reason.
David, Cheryl asks, weren't former slave owners paid reparations or restitution by the U.S. government for their economic losses following the war?
Indeed, they were. Following the rescission of the special order of General Sherman, slave owners under the regime of Andrew Johnson, successor to Abraham Lincoln, were indeed offered compensation for their losses, an indication of the very abbreviated and problematic means of coming to terms with the past, especially in the South. So that's an absolutely accurate statement, and the rapidity with which the transition occurred from compensating freed slaves to compensating former slave owners indicates, in a certain sense, encapsulates the history of the African American quest for justice after slavery, a very condensed period. We can restrict it to Reconstruction, or we can even think of it just in the period in which the Sherman decree was in place before it was rescinded. In both cases, minimal in time, minimal in scale, compared to the obeisance paid to former slave owners.
Thank you, David, so much for these most informative and interesting remarks. This historical background sets the stage for our panel discussion on the future of reparations and restorative justice in our country at present. Pastor Smart will now introduce our panel moderator, who will then introduce the panel.
It is my pleasure. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Gregory Akili. We know him as Akili. Akili has been for almost 70 plus years fighting for the liberation of all people that are disenfranchised, people that are immobile, people that are struggling each and every day. Akili has worked with Cesar Chavez. He has worked with Martin Luther King. He has worked with Dr. Maulana Karenga. He has worked with Black Lives Matter. He has worked with every single positive organization in this country and world. He's now working for World Water to instill that water is not fought over, but water is given to everybody that has a right for water. And so it's my pleasure, just one of the things he's doing. It's my pleasure to introduce Brother Akili, one of the, he's on the executive committee of Black Lives Matter. He's on the executive committee of the Black Community Clergy Labor Alliance. He's working with NAACP. He's an honoree from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Here he is, Dr. Gregory Akili.
Yeah. Thank you, Reverend Smart. I don't have a doctorate. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to work with Dr. King. But much of what you shared with people was accurate, and I'm your good friend. How about that? I want to introduce and have a discussion, if I may, and we're trying to get Dr. Julianne Malveaux on the phone, to get her on the phone so that she can participate with us. I have to offer you some apologies for our good friend Ron Daniels. The National African American Reparations Commission is meeting tonight, right now, as a matter of fact, and Dr. Ron Daniels is the convener, and Dr. Malveaux is on the commission. So they felt that both of them couldn't be here at the same time. So Dr. Malveaux will be joining us by phone, and Dr. Daniels will continue to convene the meeting. He did send a video that I unfortunately was not able to have access to and edit in time. So I want to extend my apologies for that, but extend his efforts at trying to be here tonight. So joining us this evening to have this discussion, and I want to make it a discussion as much as possible, is first, I want to start with Dr. Maulana Karenga. And I want to start that introduction by saying, Maulana is my friend. Maulana is my brother. Maulana is someone I've known since my early days and helped shape my life. Much of what I do, understand, and work today is because of Maulana. Now I'm going to give you his credentials. I'm going to give you the work that he's done. But I want to start out by saying that he is my friend and brother. And that I'm most pleased with. And I get a chance to spend time with him every Wednesday at 8 o'clock with the Black Community Clergy and Labor Alliance. So let me give you the rather formal, if I may, and background on Dr. Maulana Karenga. He is a professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at California State University, Long Beach. Maulana holds 2 PhDs. His first doctorate is in leadership and human behavior and political science, with a focus on the theory and practice of African American nationalism. His second doctorate is in social ethics, with a focus on the classical African ethics of ancient Egypt. Dr. Maulana Karenga is the author of 17 books, 57 journals, 42 book chapters, and over 650 columns on critical issues in America today. He is the executive director of the African American Cultural Center and the Kawaida Institute of Pan-African Studies here in Los Angeles, and the national and the organization US. And I guess one of the things that Maulana may be most known for by many of us, by many people around the world, Maulana is also is internationally known as the creator of Kwanzaa, the African American and Pan-African holiday celebrated throughout the world African community. And Dr. Maulana Karenga is the co-chair of the Black Community Clergy and Labor Alliance, which I am a steering committee member of. So Maulana, I want to introduce you. And then I also want to introduce our second panelist who will be joining us. And as soon as Dr. Malveaux comes on, I will give you a much more formal introduction of her. The other person I'd like to introduce is Sushama Austin-Connor, founding program director, Black Theology and Leadership Institute at Princeton Theology Seminary, Princeton University. So right now, those are the 2 people that are going to be joining us and discussing this issue of reparations with us. And we are anticipating Dr. Malveaux will be joining us. And Maulana, I wanted to start with you and open up that question, if you will, about why do you think, Maulana, that it has taken the issue of reparation has taken so long, and why is it that we are struggling for it now? And what is your understanding of reparations? And because you have this degree in African ethics and studies, I would like for you to add the African understanding and the Africanness of reparations.
I certainly would do that. Asante Sana to you, Akili, for the introduction. And I'd like to say thanks to Reverend Smart, President and CEO of the SCLC, and all those of the Black Jewish Alliance and the Heschel King Forum for the opportunity to come and participate in this discussion of one of the critical issues of our time. And on behalf of my organization, the African American Culture Center and the Black Community Clergy and Labor Alliance, we send you warm greetings of solidarity and continuing struggle. I would like to skip the deficiency of why not and talk about what reparations is, because one of the most important things is for us as a people to define reparations for ourselves and to say what are the critical elements in it so that we can strive for the right thing. So how we understand ourselves and our task dictates, shapes how we assert ourselves in the world. And so it's very important for us to recognize that ours is the most ancient of human history with an endless library of lessons in life, work, and struggle. And the struggle for reparations is part of that struggle, but there's a larger struggle for liberation and ever higher levels of human life. So rightly defined, reparations must fit in that liberation struggle. And I see reparations and the struggle for reparations as a struggle for justice for a people, accountability from oppressors, and an ethical model for the world of how to treat a grievously injured people. At the heart of this understanding is a struggle for justice. In our sacred text, the Hosea, it says that doing justice is breath to the nose. That means it is not only dignity affirming, but life enhancing, not only to the receiver, but also to the giver, because there is an interrelatedness of doing good in the world. Doing good is not difficult, the sacred text, Hosea says. Just speaking good is a monument for those who do it. For those who do good for others are also doing it for themselves, for they are, in fact, building the moral community they want and deserve to live in. And so what I want to argue is that this struggle concept that I have here is a struggle in the Fanonian and Malcolmian sense, arguing that reparations is a struggle to repair, renew, and remake ourselves in the process and practice of repairing, renewing, and remaking the world that injured us. And that we must understand ourselves as injured physicians who will heal and repair and renew ourselves and remake ourselves in the process and practice, I repeat, of repairing, renewing, and remaking the world. This process and ethical practice is called Suruj Ta, the ancient Egyptian Matin tradition, and it is in the ancient Egyptian Matin tradition, which means to repair, renew, and remake the world, making it more beautiful and beneficial than we inherited it. So our struggle for reparations is more than a quest for back payments, rightly owed, for it is more than a deceptive dependency on the actions of the oppressor. We must approach it, I repeat, as a people in its most meaningful and expansive form. That is to say, we must approach reparations as a critical site and source of our continuing struggle to create and engage and empower community, just and good societies wherever we are, and a good and sustainable world for our ancestors, ourselves, and generations to follow. Regardless of the eventual shape of the evolved discourse and policy on reparation, there are 6 essential aspects which must be addressed and included in any meaningful and moral approach to reparations. They are: first, public dialogue; second, public admission; third, public apology; fourth, public recognition; fifth, compensation; and sixth, preventive measures that require a radical reconception and reconstruction of this society. So first, let's look at quickly, there must be public dialogue in which Europeans or whites overcome their acute denial of the nature and extent of injuries inflicted on African people and concede that the most morally appropriate term for this utter destruction of human life, human culture, and human possibility is Maangamizi, or in English, Holocaust of enslavement. Secondly, there must be public admission of the Holocaust of enslavement, the Maangamizi, committed against African people by state society. And by Holocaust of Maangamizi, I mean a morally monstrous act of genocide that is not only against a targeted people, but also a crime against humanity. And this expresses itself in three basic ways: the morally monstrous destruction of human life, the morally monstrous destruction of human culture, and the morally monstrous destruction of human possibilities. We don't even know how many millions were killed in the Holocaust of enslavement. And we must develop a new language to discuss it so that we're not conceptually imprisoned in talking about it, and find ourselves talking about commerce instead of genocide. In other words, I recognize that there's slave trade, but the most definitive activity, as Walter Rodney points out in his How Europe Undeveloped Africa, is not the commerce, but the massive murder, the killing. And so we can't talk about slave trade and leave out Maangamizi or Holocaust, because what that means is that when we shift from the moral issue to the commercial one, it's like business gone bad with collateral damage. And we must, in fact, insist that this is a problem: the morally monstrous destruction of millions, and the morally monstrous destruction of human culture. And finally, the moral monstrous destruction of human possibility, lifting Africans out of their own history and culture and making them a footnote and forgotten casualty in European culture. And therefore, much of our struggle is to return to our own history so that we can begin to reconceive and reconstruct ourselves in dignity-affirming, life-enhancing, and world-preserving ways of our ancestor. And why I say Maangamizi, because some people call it Ma'afa in the movement. But Ma'afa just means a disaster. Maangamizi means an intentional destruction. So Maangamizi is to destroy utterly. But Maangamizi, Ma is an amplitive, right? It shows it's great. And so that shows intentionality. And this moves the issue from one of commerce and trade gone bad with collateral damage to a moral issue of Holocaust. Thirdly, once there's a public discussion and admission of the nature and extent of our injury, then there must be public apology. And moreover, the state must offer it on behalf of its white citizens. For the state is a crime partner with business and corporate interests in the initiation, conduct, and sustaining of this destructive process. It maintained and supported the system of destruction with law, armed forces, ideology, and brutal suppression. Thus, it must offer the apology for the great and grievous injury we call Maangamizi. Fourthly, there must be public recognition through institutional establishment, monumental construction, and educational instruction through the school and university system and the media, directed toward teaching and preserving the memory of the and the horror of this terrorism and the awesome meaning of what it means to actually be reduced to an object of labor, sex, and entertainment, and to have an imposed on a people of social death. Fifthly, reparation also requires compensation in various forms. Compensation does not automatically mean simply money payments, either individually or collectively. Indeed, it is a multidimensional demand and option, and may involve not only money, but land, free healthcare, free housing, free education from grade school to college and university. But whether we choose one or all, we must have a communal discussion of it and then make the choice. Moreover, compensation as an issue is not simply compensation for lost labor, but for the comprehensive injury, the brutal destruction of African lives, African cultures, and African possibilities during the Holocaust of enslavement, as well as subsequent forms of oppression and their historic and ongoing effect. And finally, reparation requires preventive measures, which requires a radical reconception and reconstruction of American society. These preventive measures will be institutions, processes, and practices to preclude the recurrence of such a massive destruction of human life, human culture, and human possibility. This again means that we must see and approach The reparations struggle is part and parcel of our ongoing struggle for freedom, for justice, for equality and equity, and for power over our destiny and daily life. In a word, the struggle is for liberation and ever higher levels of human life. Our struggle for reparations is and must be then an inclusive project which seeks to repair the gross and ongoing injury of one of the greatest holocausts in human history, the Holocaust of African enslavement. And this essentially means to produce, in the midst of struggle, a process by which we, the injured people, not only self-consciously understand and assert ourselves in ongoing efforts to restore a sense of wholeness, well-being, and freedom in our life, but also rightfully see ourselves as continuing our ancient ancestral struggle of expanding the realm of human freedom and flourishing, bringing good into the world and coming into the fullness of ourselves. And so reparation as a world-encompassing ethical idea and practice of repairing, restoring, and remaking the world, Suruj's Ta, provides us with an expansive concept of understanding and approaching our lives, our work, and struggle in the world. Indeed, it translates as reparations in the most expansive sense and roots us in a world-encompassing ethical project worthy of our collective vocation as a people. And so I wanted to close and say that in waging this struggle, our goal is ma'at, rightness and good in the world, rightness and good for the world. And if reparations is to be our collective vocation, we must involve our people on every level, expand our presence in the major institutions of our community and society, and dare to impact and shape social discourse and policy of how this is defined. Because right now, there's no central definition and discussion of what it should be. And we must take that as a priority item. And we must understand, finally, ourselves as injured physicians who have the capacity to and must heal, repair, renew, and remake ourselves in the process and practice of repairing, renewing, and remaking the world, transforming it into an ever-expanding realm of freedom, human freedom, justice, and flourishing. For we are indeed our own liberators. And given this, as we've said so often, in the context of oppression, there is no remedy except resistance, no medical social strategy that does not privilege and promote struggle, and no future or possibility of reparations or flourishing except that forged on the battlefield for a new and beautiful world in the interest of African and human good and the well-being of the world.
Asante Maulana for that grounding, Sante for that definition, excuse me, and explanation. And I think it leads us by the natural course to bringing on Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who is the president emeritus of Bennett College for Women. She is an economist, an author, and commentator on popular education and commercial television. You've seen her before, probably on USA Today, Black Ms. Magazine, CNN, BET, PBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, and C-SPAN. Dr. Malveaux is a committed activist and civic leader and has held many positions in women's organizations and civil rights organizations. Dr. Malveaux has also lectured at more than 500 colleges and universities and corporate events. For the past 5 years, Dr. Malveaux has focused on and centered her efforts on public speaking appearances and her work as a broadcast and print journalist. So Dr. Malveaux, I think it only fitting that if anybody could follow Maulana, it would be you. So would you, Dr. Malveaux, like to pick up and expand on and continue the discussion about the value, meaning, and impact of reparations and the restorative process we need? And thank you for joining us. Dr. Malveaux, she's on the phone. And you need to unmute yourself. Chris, there she is. Chris, can we unmute her?
Okay.
Ah.
Hello, hello.
Yes, we hear you and welcome. We are so glad that you could join us. And I've just read for the past half hour or so your bio. So everybody
No,
knows.
you didn't read it for half an hour because I was listening to Maulana about 5 minutes ago. And of course, I will always like to give my greetings to my brother. And I appreciated what he had to say. It was right on time, right on point. And I just want to apologize to you and to your assembled guests. I don't know what's going on with my technology, but it ain't going on. Just ain't going on.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you. So, you have a question, comment, what you want me to do?
Well, if you heard what Maulana was talking about, and Maulana gave us, I think, a grounding for what.
Oh, he absolutely did, yes.
For what reparation is and can be. Can you talk about and you're an economist, talk a little bit about the economic, social, and political impact of reparations?
Well, let me begin by saying this. Racism, discrimination, patriarchy are baked in the cake that we call America. I mean, I'm very amused these days when I look at people talking about, well, you know, the racism or the Georgia voting. This was baked in the cake. So how do you get the crap out the cake just to make it clean? And it's almost impossible. So the cake that was baked, of course, enabled enslavement. And Maulana is right when he talks about the language. Those not slavery, enslavement. But that was baked in the cake. We spent from 1619 until 1865 as enslaved people. There was about a 5-minute period, not 5 minutes, 1865 to maybe 1876. So a 10-year period where Black people made some gains. We had people elected to state office. We had a couple of Black senators. Yes. We had, what's his name? George White, who was the senator from the Phoenix Awards, the Congressional Black Caucus always holds. He laid it out. He said, we have this many teachers and this many acres and all of this. But when white folks saw us getting that, they got crazy and they decided to take it back. And that was the Jim Crow laws and the post-Reconstruction era. So while a lot of my fellow economists want to look at the period of enslavement, my work tends to look at the period post-enslavement to where they actually passed laws to prevent us from owning, passed laws to prevent us from progressing, and to pass laws that literally enabled economic envy via lynching. So one of the first lynchings that we can document is one of Tommy Moss and two of his friends. They were friends of Ida B. Wells. Tommy Moss was a brother who was also the postmaster. You know, back in those days, that was the best you could do. Made good money. He decided to open a grocery store across the street from a white man's store. Now, he decided to open the grocery store because the white man's store was nasty. White men were in there. They talked SPAC, and they, and I said SPAC because I know, you know, it's your program. But they talked nasty to Black women. They gambled. They played cards. It was unrespectable. So Tommy Moss said, let's open a store. So they opened the People's Grocery, he and two of his friends. And the white man was not happy that he had competition, right? Economic envy. So the white man, a little white boy, a little Black boy got into a fight over some marbles. The white man went to Tommy Moss's store with his gun over marbles, to say, I'm not going to have this happen. And the next thing you know, 3 Black men were lynched. Tommy Moss and his 2 friends were lynched. And if it was just a lynching, I might be okay. No, I would never be okay. But the white man got Tommy Moss's store for 8 cents on the dollar of what it was worth. 8 cents on the dollar. That's why reparations are important. Because it wasn't just that they stole his store for 8 cents on the dollar, but that they discouraged any other Black man or woman from opening a store. See, Ida B. Wells said lynching was the first indication of white supremacy. And basically, lynchings were not done to the person who was lynched. It was done to the whole community. Richard Wright wrote about lynchings and how it basically suppressed Black initiative. And it certainly did. We can go then, fast forward to Wilmington, North Carolina in 1896, where, this is interesting, I always say this is interesting when I tell stories, but this is interesting because Black people and white Republicans had formed a coalition to get rid of the racist Democrats who were running the county. So the night before the vote, the white Democrat, they call them red shirts then, they went house to house and arrested all the prominent Black men, the doctors, the lawyers, all of that. They held them overnight and the next day put them on buses out of town. They had to leave everything they had. One brother had to leave his printing press. I mean, you just go down the list. People left their homes. In some cases, these red shirts went house to house and forced people to sign quitclaim deeds on their homes. Even the whole story has not even been told. There's a brother down in Wilmington who's doing research on it, but the casual stories are the river ran red. The river ran red, which means that's how many people were killed. Now, they claim it was 60-something, but, you know, it was more than 60-something. In any case, fast forward to Tulsa. Same thing. In fact, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it's amazing to me, the governor appointed a commission to figure out what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, and people know the story, where a little boy, Dick Rowland is his name, bumped into a white girl, Sarah Page, and the next thing you know, he had raped her. Well, she never pressed charges. She said no, that never happened. But anyway, of course, white people went crazy, and the newspaper in that town had a headline: "To lynch a Negro tonight." That was a headline at the newspaper. So basically, when the governor appointed this commission to talk about what happened, their conclusion, Greg, was too many N-words have too much money. Because basically in Tulsa, we owned a movie theater, auto repair shop. We built a library where the white folks said we could not use their library. We built our own. And you could just go down the list. They burnt out, like, I don't even have the number in front of me, but several square blocks. They burnt out millions of dollars of Black property. Why do we need reparations? Come on. Because not only did the Tulsa story affect the Black people in Tulsa, it affected Black people everywhere. When you institute a regime of terrorism, you are telling Black people you cannot go up. You cannot do more. You cannot have more. Racism is baked in the cake that's called America, and America needs to unpack the cake by apologizing, by basically doing recompense. IBW21.org. There is a 10-point program that the NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, has that talks about the many ways that we must lift up and manage the whole thing about what has happened to Black people and why this is a part of America. And I hear all these people say, oh yeah, but I never had any slaves. You didn't have to. All you had to do was participate in a foundational operation that excluded Black people. All you had to do is be a part of a union that did not allow Black people in that union. And that was most unions until A. Philip Randolph got up in the Kool-Aid. And excuse my colloquial, but it's been an interesting day. So our unions actually excluded Black people. Now, subsequently, and if we look today, Black people who belong to unions do better than those who do not. So we're gonna own that. But at the same time, what we know is that the history of exclusion has basically oppressed Black people. So the case for reparations is about the case for how many ways were we excluded, not only implicitly, but explicitly. Then I think we want to look at things like the GI Bill, which basically excluded Black people. We want to look at the very, very many ways that people were, quote, made whole. And they were not made whole on racial terms. In Mississippi, there were less than 1,000 Black men after World War II who were able to get BA degrees. There were thousands of white men who were. Many brothers who wanted to get a BA were told, well, you could go, we'll take you to barber school. We'll teach you agriculture. So many white folks got a leg up after World War II. A lot of Black people didn't. And we can look at the terms and conditions of World War II where we fought. Black men and women fought, but were never made whole. So we can walk through down memory lane and talk about the reasons for reparations. And what I would say is that people of good conscience, whether they're Black or white, Asian, Latino, Latinx, if you are of conscience and you understand history, then you must understand the very many ways that Black people have been economically peripheralized. And much of it has to be done with economic envy, because we were ready. At the end of enslavement, you had industrious Black people who were ready to compete. We were never able or allowed to compete. In 1900, there were more than 120 Black-owned banks. Today, there are 23. What's that about? That's about manipulating banking regulations to make sure that Black people did not get a foot in. Now, I'm not going to say that there's some mismanagement here and mismanagement there, but by and large, when white folks mismanaged banks, they got help. When Black folks mismanaged banks, they got kicked to the curb. Brother Akili, I could go on and on and on, but I know you don't want me to.
Well, I am, and I know that, and much of what you are saying, I think, contextualized, where Maulana grounded us in both the Africanness of it and the universality of it. Certainly, what you have done is then take us to the more practical phases of it. And I want to talk with our Princeton participant, and I want to get the name right, Sushama Austin-Connor, who is the founding program director at Black Theology and Leadership Institute at Princeton University School of Theology. I want to ask you now about what role do you see the church playing in this? What role does theology have in perpetuating the institutional racism that has been, as Dr. Malveaux has talked about, baked in, if you will, to the America of today? So Ms. Austin-Connor, talk a little bit about, first of all, why you founded the Black Theology and Leadership Institute, and how does it connect to support for and participation in reparations?
Sure. So it's Sushama Austin-Connor. So thank you for having me. I don't actually know what world it's actually fair that I follow Professor Karenga and Dr. Malveaux. I just actually really don't. And I could listen to both of them all night. And I just want to say to Dr. Karenga, what an honor to just be on a panel and to be able to hear your words in some sort of real time here. So thank you for all you have done for our community and for so many generations. Thank you so much. I'm gonna take a little screenshot so I can show my two boys later. And I really will. And Dr. Malveaux, thank you as well. And I don't know if you remember, but you spoke at my wedding. And when I saw you on this call, I said, I'm gonna have to remind you, my dad is Bobby Austin. and you were a part of
Oh,
my wedding.
yes.
Seemed like centuries ago, but it's just great to hear your voice and to know that you're as active as ever. And I see you on the news, and this is just a tremendous honor.
You had a beautiful wedding. You're a beautiful bride.
Thank you. Thank you. So small world. So I'll say too a little bit about my work, because I think my work at Princeton Theological Seminary engages a couple of pieces of what Dr. Karenga and Dr. Malveaux have talked about in shaping kind of what the future of this could look like. What if an institution is willing to look at its ills and its wrongs, what could be possible? Before I give a really quick summary of what Princeton Seminary has done, I will follow up with what Akili asked me about the Black Theology and Leadership Institute, which is an institute that I founded at Princeton Seminary in 2012. And it is a national continuing education event for clergy and lay leadership to come to Princeton Seminary and to look at large theological themes, to hear preachers. Our first preacher that we ever had at the program was James Forbes. We've had, we have a preacher in residence every year of that caliber. So it's a fellowship program. So we have a large application pool, and then 50 people are chosen. They do a summer fellowship a week in July. And then they're just sort of a part of the Black theology and leadership community. So that's one way in which I think for each BTLI, it is undergirded by social justice. That's like every year. Whatever our theme is, it has to be, and is just inherently connected to social justice. So that's one way that my work connects. But the direct way that I think, the more direct way that I think my work connects to this conversation, though, is having been at Princeton Seminary for nearly 10 years now, I have seen the arc of the conversation that Princeton has tried to have, from its actions in thinking and contemplating and discerning reparations and repentance for slavery, to actually then adopting a multi-year plan for repentance and making an actual tangible commitment to the seminary's future. What they found out and what they ended up doing, I'm going to quickly go through, because I think it is important to say this is how this could actually work on some level if an institution will go deep and do some sacred listening. So in spring 2016, the president of our seminary, his name is Craig Barnes, he commissioned a committee of faculty, students, alum, and administrators to look at our institution's ties to slavery and its complicity in racist history.
Somebody to mute their phone or mute the screen if you would.
It's okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
You tell me, should I keep going? Okay. A few highlights of that audit, and this was a year-long, almost 18-month-long audit. What we uncovered, and we in the large we, I wasn't on the committee that actually did this work, but I have been on the committee that looked at some of the recommendations. A few highlights of what the audit uncovered. The obvious, the seminary founders had ties to slavery. Those ties to slavery shaped theological study, it shaped economic development, and it shaped the mission of our church in society. How the seminary did benefit from the slave economy. It included their investments in Southern banks, things that financed the seminary facilities, and then actual participation of faculty and board members in a very, very racist society called the American Colonization Society, which was a group that existed up until 1964, actually, which pushed for sending freed slaves to Africa. And there are board members that were on that committee. Students pushed this initiative. So the Association of Black Seminarians at Princeton Seminary were big in pushing the seminary to look at this and sort of forcing their hands in terms of laying out recommendations that were really clear they wanted no less than 15% of the seminary's income, which would be roughly a little more than $5 million a year. So while that exact amount did not happen, the Board of Trustees did unanimously adopt a multi-year plan to repent for the seminary's relationship to slavery. And they committed to some tangible actions. Part of those tangible actions will directly impact my work. The Center for Black Church Studies, where I am, will be directly impacted. We will get money and better resourcing and a new director and staff for the center. So that will be a part of that first rollout. There is a $27 million pledge, $1 million a year, and $27 million set aside in the endowment. And again, I'll just add what I think has been some of the theme. In some ways, this isn't quantifiable. How do you quantify the amount? But I think that what is good here and is hopeful is that this is a start. It's a start. It is not perfect. There is not an amount that will be perfect, but it is a start. And this is our seminary's way of starting some of that conversation. And I want to say, too, that I was telling Akili, I come to this work in very specific ways, which is why I say I could sit and hear real experts talk about this all night. But I do come as a faith leader. I come as a social justice advocate, a committed Christian. But mostly I come as a mother who has two sons who I hope for a future where they are not bound and their children's children are not bound by race and racism and white supremacy. And that in my lifetime will be my continued work.
Thank you. And one of the things that we may want to do is use that what happened at Princeton as a way to review and get us on the road. Dr. Karenga, I want to come back to you because I think, once again, you grounded us in what reparations is. I want to come back and then try to get your understanding about, and you laid out those 6 points. How do we begin to make them, what are the first steps on that 6 points? And the National African American Reparations Committee has a 10-point program. But I want to come back to you, Dr. Karenga, if I may, and talk about making it real today.
Yeah, appreciating what you said, if I'm saying correct. I'm glad you came back to me because you said that Dr. Malveaux did the practical and I did something else or something. But I did both theory and practice, right? So I first defined what reparations was. Then I gave you a concrete, practical way to approach this in those 6+1 points. Right? The first thing I said we have to do, this is real. And you can tell it with our response and with the response around the country, right? We have piecemeal approaches to this. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. They're good, but they could be better by unity, right? So I said the first thing that we have to do, Akili and everyone else on the panel, Dr. Austin-Connor and Dr. Malveaux, is that we have to have this public dialogue so that we define exactly what we have. So we have a common understanding of what we're struggling for. Is it just money? Then we can skip to compensation, right? But I said we have some preliminary work on the way to compensation. Now, this compensation processes, we got Dr. Shirley Weber has a bill 3120, AB 3121, that is going on. We got one in Evanston. We got some around the country, and we just heard from Princeton, right? So we have all these initiatives. When do we tie them together in a unified dialogue about what we're actually struggling for? Because the dominant society is going to piecemeal us to death. 10 million here, 10 million there. And we're owed trillions at least. There's no compensation for loss of a life. They can never pay us for the damage, overwhelming damage they've done to us, right? Genocidal damage, right? Not only physical genocide, but cultural genocide at the same time. So we have to talk about that, right? So that's the first thing. We got to be clear about that. And we have to get whites to face the fact of what they've done to us and stop blaming history on us. Don't blame history on me. We didn't come to them. They came to us, right? So we have to talk about that, right? Not these little huggy meetings where people, you get together and everybody agrees that something's wrong and then you go on home. Okay, and I'm going to send you a donation, that kind of stuff. We don't need it. We need radical transformation. Second thing we need is for us to acknowledge the extent of the injury. And I said that the best word for that is maangamizi. There's another word, ma'afa, and these are both Swahili words, but they mean Holocaust, right? Now, sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't use that word. And Native Americans use that also, some of the scholars. But let's face it, this is not to take away the uniqueness of the Jewish Holocaust. Why would we try to do that? I mean, there's no need for that. But the Jews have two words also for Holocaust, right? Shoah in Hebrew, Chaban in Yiddish, right? So, and we have two, Ma'afa and Maangamizi. I prefer Maangamizi. I introduced that because I wanted to stress intentionality, and that's one of my languages, Swahili. So that's very important to me. And then third thing is then the apology. See, one of the problems with apologies that's going on is that the oppressor or the perpetrator is actually defining not only what the injury is, but how much money they're going to give us and what they're going to apologize for. What kind of reparations is that? When the offender is actually telling you what the injury is, how much they're going to pay for you, and how you should call the injury. I'm not even for that. I don't do that, right? So then next is recognition. People forget, Akili and fellow participant, people forget. And so we build monuments, right? We build monuments. We teach the horror and meaning of this Maangamizi, this Holocaust, not only to us as African people, but also to the world. What does it mean to kill millions? The loss of one life is a tragedy. How much more are millions and millions, tens of millions? And guess what? Hiding what has been done under a commercial category called trade. As Walter Rodney said, there's too much violence in this to be simply trade. Yes, there is a dimension of it that's commercial, but the most important aspect is the morally monstrous destruction of human life, human culture, and human possibility. And that cannot be summed up into the word trade, business gone bad with collateral damage. And that's, again, why intentionality is so important. And then we teach it. We got to, just like we struggled with Shirley and Dr. Weber to get AB 1460 so we can teach African, Native American, African, Chicano, Latino, Latina, and Asian history and culture and intellectual traditions, right? In this, and our struggles in the system. And inside that is a discussion of one of the most important and modal periods in our life that defines our life even now. And that is the Holocaust of enslavement, or Maangamizi, as we say in Swahili, right? So I think it's very important for us to see that. Then compensation. That's what your 10-point program is mainly on, compensation. But there's a precedent to develop. And I appreciate the 10 points. So I'm not in any way criticizing anybody for what they're doing. In fact, I'm praising them because as Malcolm said, wherever we are, there's a battle line. Whether you're in the East or the West or North or the South, you and I are living in a country that is a battle line for all of us as Black people. And Paul Robeson said the battlefront is everywhere. There's no sheltered rear. So that means that, yes, but what is the compensation? What is the minimum compensation we want? Can we agree on that, right? And so that when people make these charges and challenges to their city or their state, which they're doing, what document do they draw from? What common sense of ourselves do we draw from? That's what I want to do. And that's what I want in COBRA to do, as well as the National Coalition of Afro-American Reparations. I want all of us, and of course, our organization, us, the African American Culture Center, the Black Community Clergy and Labor Alliance. And so the compensation can be free education, money, of course, payments, direct payment, but we have to talk about how that's done. Some people, I don't know if Oprah needs the money, right? So we have to talk about collective, how we do this in a collective sense, right? And then education, land back, return of our land, right? We need to get some of these things back that Dr. Malveaux was saying was taken from us by force and violence, right? We got to look this up and get some compensation for this. And then the second thing, of course, there's so many things we can do for compensation, healthcare, housing, et cetera. And some of people doing that, right? And then final thing is this whole idea, and I think you know this, Akili, and this is your life too, the struggle. That's what Black Lives Matter is all about, the struggle, right? So that we can live a full and meaningful life, so that we can leave a legacy worthy of the name in history, African, so that we can leave something for the next generation, so they can build on the legacy that we left, even as we build on the legacy before us. And that means that we have to struggle. There is no alternative to righteous and relentless struggle to create the good world we all want and deserve to live in. Without reparations being a part of that struggle, it's just an isolated process that eventually will be overwhelmed with whatever that comes. We must create the space for this to be recognized, respected, and responded to righteously and rightfully.
Sante Maulana, and I appreciate what you're saying. And in the last few minutes that we have, I want to bring in Dr. Malveaux and talk a little bit about HR 40. You testified at one of the first hearings last year around HR 40. So Dr. Malveaux, would you kind of bring us up to date on what's happening with HR 40, what it is, and how it's moving?
Congressman John Conyers. Sheila Jackson Lee took the mantle from Congressman John Conyers and reintroduced HR 40, which, as you know, has been introduced every year since 1989. So this has been so Maulana is right. This has been the length of the struggle. Recognize that reparations is extraordinarily important. And it's not just about the money. I want people to get, from my perspective, now others have, but it's also about basically restorative justice.
Yes.
It's about dealing with the things that we've lost in terms of our community. I mentioned the last time I spoke about the number of Black banks we had that we now don't have. And we can go down the list about, this COVID mess, the impact on our mental health that we've seen. So it's healthcare, it's all of these things. But HR 40 is a bill that basically, number one, studies the impact of enslavement on Black people, and number two, suggests remedies for the impact of enslavement on Black people. It used to just be number one, but now it's number 1 and 2. It has over 200 co-sponsors in the Congress, and it should be passed. Now, the challenge, of course, is that everybody crazy. There's a more academic way to say this, but just let me be me for a moment. I mean, there are white folks who don't believe we should have reparations. There are other people of color who they want theirs too. And the thing is that, as I said, the fundamental flaw of this so-called American system was the enslavement of Black people and the removal of Native American people from their own land. Those are flaws. And we have to really begin to deal with that. So HR 40 begins to deal with that at some level. There was a companion bill that Cory Booker introduced on the Senate side, but neither of these have gone forward. President Biden has said that he's okay with it, but he hasn't been enthusiastic. Frankly, neither has Kamala, and we adore Kamala, but this is not number one on their list of priorities. And so we have to be really clear about that. What's number one on their list of priorities? And this is not it. Just like DC statehood, which is another form of reparations, frankly, DC statehood is not number one on anybody's list of priorities. And so you have 700,000 people in this District of Columbia. There are more of us here than in Wyoming, and about 5 other states, but we have no input into the vote or into the voice. But back to reparations, what we must do is look at the wealth gap and the way that public policy in these United States has exacerbated the wealth gap. That's all reparations is about. How is the wealth gap wider? Because certain people, melanin deficient people, basically declared war on Black people's accumulation. It's on Black accumulation that the war was declared on. So when you saw us with stuff, all kind of things happen. I can tell you personal stories of people who basically, and they're not funny stories, but they had their business in a white person's name because they knew that if it was in their name, they might be cheated or lynched or whatever. In my own family, we always talk about the myth of the moving fence. We owned well, we got it from the white folks, but that's another story. But we owned a little bayou where you could go down there and fish. And we let everybody fish there, white folks, Black folks, whatever. But one day we woke up and this was 1930, so it wasn't we. I ain't that old. But anyway, the fence had moved. The fence had moved. And white folks just decided they wanted that bayou. So they moved the fence. So there's a little piece of land in Moss Point, Mississippi called Hawkins Lane, which is named after us, after my ancestors. But the fact is that they moved the fence. And we all have these stories.
Well, let me do this because we have come to the end of the program. First of all, let me thank all of the participants. I want to thank specifically Dr. Maulana Karenga, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, and Sushama Austin-Connor. Thank you all. And then thank all of the participants that shared information that showed light. And the one thing that I want to ask you to do is go to ibw.21.org, IBW 21st Century, and look at the 10-point program that Dr. Malveaux and others are working on with the National African American Reparations Commission. And also, I want to start with something that that Dr. Karenga talked about, and that was the dialogue, having more public dialogues around what reparation is and why it is necessary. So once again, I want to thank everybody, particularly SCLC and the Black Jewish Alliance for hosting us this evening and for preparing this for this evening. And I trust that this will be only the first of many discussions, engagements, and educations that we engage in the next few months and years as we move closer to achieving reparations. Maulana, I will see you in the morning. Dr. Karenga, I will see you in the morning. I will see you in the morning. And I look forward to it. So thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to more discussions around reparations and the restorative justice.
Thank you, Akili. Thank you for moderating this discussion. I think your questions and your very presence stimulated and informed the conversation. And thank you to our terrific panelists. The Black Jewish Justice Alliance is also about action. And our committee member, Karen Hilfman, is going to tell you about some of the action items that we're going to suggest that you join us and participate in. Karen?
Thank you. So as we come together to learn, we also want to make time for action, as Patsy said. Study and action are different sides of the same coin, and both are necessary to help bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. HR 40, as a number of panelists mentioned, right now is the holy grail of the reparations movement, and will begin to, on a national level, open up that conversation to start talking about the things that Dr. Karenga, Dr. Malveaux, and Sushama have all talked about. It's closer to passing now in the House than it's ever been before, but the pressure on legislators in these next 2 weeks is going to be crucial. Here are some resources, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Most of the slides that we're going to share have links, and I invite you to take quick screenshots of them if you can. And I apologize that you'll have to enter the links later manually on your browser, but at least the links are short. Congress.gov has summaries and full texts, lists, co-sponsors of both the House and Senate bill, and will track their progress. Both of the bills are pretty much identical. These resources have great background information on reparations and answers to frequently asked questions. The Why We Can't Wait letter was sent to Congress last summer, and the Black Jewish Justice Alliance is proud to be one of its almost 300 signatories. These links have everything you'll need to contact your Democratic legislators to sign onto the bill as co-sponsors. And we ask you to please take a little bit of time to do it. The ask is urgent. The House Judiciary Committee will likely vote in the next 2 weeks on HR 40, and the full House will vote soon after that. The more co-sponsors a bill has, the better its chances are for passing with a robust majority, and we really need that. In California, our new Senator, Alex Padilla, hasn't signed on to S40, the Senate reparations bill. Dianne Feinstein has. Even though the Senate isn't voting yet, Padilla needs to hear from us now that we want him to co-sponsor the bill. It would be unconscionable today not to mention taking action on voting rights in light of the new draconian voter suppression laws in Georgia, primarily impacting Black, brown, and poor voters. Here's a sample email you can send with addresses to the heads of Georgia's largest corporations, asking them to use their influence to stop the voter suppression. We also want to update you on the 2 voting rights bills currently in Congress, which would supersede state law in federal elections. HR 1, For the People Act, expands voting rights and adds other supports for our democracy. It's passed the House and it's now in the Senate awaiting action. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act restores the key provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It passed in the House last session, but died in the Senate. Mitch McConnell never moved it forward. It's going to be introduced again in the House this month, where it will pass and be sent to the Senate for action. We can take action now on these bills by asking our senators to support HR 1 and HR 4, and our representatives in the House to support HR 4. We can also extend our reach on all necessary legislation by asking friends and family in other states and districts to contact their legislators too. May we go onward together. And now back to Patsy and Reverend Smart for our closing.
Thank you very much, Karen. If you could put some of that information in the chat, people are requesting it.
I will do my best.
Stop your screen sharing.
Yeah.
Our next endeavor is going to commemorate the assassinations of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. We would greatly appreciate your donations to allow us to continue this work. Thank you. Pastor Smart?
I want to thank our exciting speakers with your knowledge, helping us to get to the next point. Also, I want to thank my brother Akili for a fine, outstanding job. And Patsy, I want to thank you and our earlier program participants. Now is the time for action, as Karen talked about. And so the rest of this week, as this is what we're calling sacrifice, and also call, as you know, we're calling it the beloved, creating the beloved community in Los Angeles. Tomorrow night, we will be involved with a program with the API community starting at 6 o'clock. You can go on our you can go on our Facebook page to see the exact time. I might have told you the wrong time. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's all on our Facebook page, SCLC. And also on Friday, our young people are going to be talking about things. On Thursday, all day Thursday, we are going to be giving out COVID vaccinations. And listen to me carefully, if you want a vaccination, don't worry about your age, just sign up and come, because there disproportionately have been distributed in the African American community and brown communities, and now there's a lot of programs that's correcting that. We need the vaccination to right the wrongs, and so that's happening. And also on Saturday afternoon, we'll have our 5th annual Martin Luther King luncheon. Dr. Karenga, you remember that the very first Martin Luther King luncheon was right there at the African American Cultural Center 7 years ago, and we're continuing the tradition. So join us as we're honoring 6 people who are doing outstanding work to bring about the beloved community in Los Angeles. Remember, regardless of what, we've got to bring about the beloved community. That means, as King said, an inside search of ourselves, but then a radical transformation of the world. Get ready and come on and join us. God bless you and good night.